So Lewis, just tell me a bit about yourself. I understand you've had quite the career history, and I'm just interested to know a bit about your journey to AKTC.
I was born in a Spanish family. My father was an art historian, so I inherited that passion for art, and I am myself an archaeologist and art historian. I was, first of all, an archaeologist in Egypt and Sudan in my very early age, during the construction of the Aswan Dam that will flood part of the Nubian territory. That was a very good experience. Then I became a curator in a medieval art museum in Barcelona, my native city. And then that led me to become the director of the International Council of Museums in UNESCO in Paris. From there, I moved to California, to Los Angeles, California, where I became the founding director of the Getty Conservation Institute at the Getty Trust, where I spent several years. Then I came back to, this is a long story, I'm sorry.
I know, it's brilliant.
People are going to be very bored. But then I came back to Spain, and I was the general director of a new foundation created by the merger of two important savings banks. And there I met His Highness. How I arrived here is very simple. During my time in Los Angeles, one of my neighbors was at that time somebody not as famous as he is today, Frank Gehry, the architect.
Wow.
And he has his office very near my place, and we became friends. Frank Gehry became, because of his celebrity, became one of the members of the master jury of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1992.
Okay.
And then, at that time, the members of the jury, as it is the case still today, recommended possible people for the next cycle of the award. And Frank Gehry, without consulting me, proposed me for the jury. And then is where I met His Highness. So I served in that jury. After that, His Highness asked me to serve for 2 consecutive terms at the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And when I thought that I was not going to be involved with him in anything else, he proposed me to come to the job where I am today. So it is a long story.
Fantastic.
So I mean, it means that I've been, in fact, in contact with His Highness since 1993.
Wow, that's quite a journey.
And that allows me, my journey allows me another thing which I think is important, is to put in perspective his personality vis-a-vis all these people that I've been reporting to before working for him. And that's something that gives you a perspective of the uniqueness of his personality.
Fantastic. So I need to ask you, so your role today, Louise, I know when I get home, my 5-year-old is going to ask me who I met today. And I'd love for you to help me explain to her what your role is today and what you do. What does the AKTC do?
How old you say?
She's 5.
5. Oh, what a difficult thing. But I could imagine a conversation you you will have with your daughter. Let me improvise. You will come and say, what do you like to do in the park? And she will say probably, I like playing. Mm-hmm. And you play with other children? Yes, yes. And what you see in the park? And I say, I see birds. I see the water. I see the plants. And I say, well, you can tell your daughter, I've seen a man today that builds parks. And he does it with a large team of people because of the mandate he has received. And then at this moment, your daughter will not understand what mandate is. But when she gets older, you can expand your explanation of what I do. I do simply, what I do by mandate of His Highness is to bring together a team of competent professionals in different areas that allow the Aga Khan Trust for Culture to develop its programs in the Award for Architecture, the Award for Music, the Education Program, the Historic Cities Program, etc., etc. And perhaps during this conversation we will be able to speak about that.
Absolutely. And we talk about, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which obviously you lead. Culture doesn't always spring to mind as the sort of priority area when we think about development. We think about health, we think about education. So I'm just trying to understand, if you could help me think through why culture.
It's a very difficult question. But culture is something that is perceived in very different manners by different people. I remember when I was a student, I had to write a paper about culture. And I started by looking at definitions. I found that there were more than 200 possible definitions of culture. I would like to say it's like the soul of our body. We don't see the soul, but it is there. It's the software that makes us rational, that gives us an identity, that makes us have feelings. And in a way, in development, culture is this essential ingredient that allows people to feel that they belong to a community, that allows people to understand that there are other communities with other cultures that should be respected. This is I know all this is very, very, very generic, but in the case of His Highness' intentions, what culture should be a component of AKDN, because in that case it's very clear. He understands, first of all, culture as material culture. And there we talk about the built environment. We talk about cities, old cities, what humanity has created. And the understanding that this is the most important framework for our lives. That if we destroy this built environment, if we think that this is a fungible environment that should be renovated totally every generation, we will lose our identity and we will not contribute to improve our quality of life. The mandate of culture in AKDN is also immaterial, in the sense that His Highness has created the Aga Khan for music, Aga Khan Award for Music, and that recognizes traditions that have existed in the Muslim world and now within the Muslim diaspora that are also fundamental to understand our identities. But I think in culture, if we talk about cultural heritage, is also a powerful symbol. And I think when we preserve, conserve, restore, rehabilitate, for example, historic cities, we are preserving assets that have an economic potential for current and future generations. It's obvious that people visit historic cities because of their cultural heritage. It's obvious that this generates employment and that in many cases, as His Highness said, the cultural heritage is the only viable asset that the community has.
What's the original vision for establishing AKTC and its evolution through time in the last 20 years?
When I look at what His Highness has done, the trajectory of his thinking, I see that he, as you said, he has proceeded incrementally. And he has proceeded by a very clear order of priorities, establishing universities, health, so dealing with education and the most direct elements of welfare. And then he created the Award for Architecture because he thought that improving the quality of architecture will have a direct impact in the lives of people. And that was the origin, the reason for creating an award for architecture. Then, because of the activities of the award, he also identified the need of dealing with more than individual buildings, to deal with the urban fabric, for the territory where people, or most of the humanity now, is urban and not rural. And then is how the Historic Cities program emerged. Initially, until 20 years ago, it was a modest program that only dealt with individual buildings. But since the construction of the Al-Azhar Park and the project around it into these very important historic districts of Darb el-Ahmar and Gamaliya, then the Historic Cities program has developed these new strategies and this philosophy of the rehabilitation of the urban heritage as a springboard for the local communities in social and economic terms. So this was the process, a very empirical in his mind. And then if one continues to see what I call the trajectory of his thinking and strategy, you arrive to the last element in culture, which is the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, which makes sense in relating it with the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture in Harvard and MIT as an enclave in North America where both Muslim and non-Muslims will have an access to what is the culture of the Muslim world, past and present.
So you mentioned the Aga Khan Museum. It'd be interesting to just understand a bit more about the significance of the museum and the intended impact.
Well, the museums are places where you see real things, real objects, collections of things, both contemporary and ancient. And I think the value of museums for any visitor is the emotional impact that you have from a real object. I mean, sometimes these objects are very, very modest. You know, one of the most celebrated objects in the museum in Washington, the Smithsonian Museum of Air and Space, is the toothbrush that the first astronauts used on the moon, and this is celebrated like a masterpiece. So first of all, the creation of a museum in Toronto, the Aga Khan Museum, corresponds in the strategy of His Highness to put in North America a very important collection of objects that depicts the very important contribution that Muslim societies have made in the realm of art and creativity through history, from the Maghreb to Southeast Asia. And this, I think, is important in a context, in a multicultural context like is North America. The museum in Toronto has developed the virtual programs on the net that have made the museum available to a large number of people of different origins and particularly young people. In that respect, in the past few years, and in a way, thanks to this COVID, this circumstance that closed museum, the museum had to find a way to get out of its physical building. And we are at this moment in a very interesting period where the museum is ongoing, I would not say a transformation, an evolution. And as I said, the museum has to be seen in the context of the institutions that His Highness has planned in North America, where such an important community of Ismaili people live.
That's amazing. So you think about the trajectory of the museum and then the trajectory of the Trust for Culture. Where do you see it going in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I think it's very difficult to give a forecast. But I think what is important, and His Highness has always wanted us to do, is to have a sense of anticipation. And to anticipate things demands to be very close to the ground, listening to people, understanding the new cultural phenomena. I mean, there is where culture comes, how our culture is evolving. Because you were asking about culture before. Culture is an evolutionary process. It's not a fixed thing. And the new generations are inventing a new culture, and inventing new languages, are inventing new interests. And this is the history of humanity. So to plan the next 10 years, it requires to anticipate what it could happen. Today, of course, I don't want to speculate about it, but today we have an avalanche of information through the media, which sometimes could cloud knowledge in the sense that makes it even more difficult to understand what are the trends that they are significant, they are going to be durable, which are going to mark the evolution of our societies. But I think what is obvious is that as the humanity is starting to fulfill basic needs, or at least a large segment of humanity is fulfilling its material needs, culture is every time more important. And culture is a fundamental part of another space of time that people need, which is a space of leisure.
Fantastic. So just in addition to the anticipation that you're talking about and trying to look to the future and kind of getting ahead of it, what else is it that sort of separates or stands AKTC apart from other cultural institutions?
AKTC, in as much as I know, is quite a unique institution. First of all, because the way it has been designed by His Highness, with this panoply of things, architecture, music, education, cultural heritage, etc. Second, because since the appearance of the Historic Cities program, we have been the only institution, I could say that without being prudish, the only institution in the world that has been linking the cultural heritage with social and economic development and demonstrating that this is not a theory, demonstrating it through projects in cities like Cairo, Kabul, Hyderabad, Delhi, etc., etc., and showing that an investment and rehabilitation of cultural assets, public spaces, combined with the introduction of microfinance programs and health services, that has a direct impact, not only in improving the quality of life of people, but also the capacity to generate income to their own activities. We have, for example, in the Historic Cities program, in each city where we work, and the other aspect of our work that makes us unique is that we are not there for a short term. When we enter into a city, we understand that to be able to promote positive change, we need to spend many years of presence and incrementally develop our presence. And throughout these years, we introduce a methodology to measure what is the impact in the life of people through a number of baseline surveys that allow us to know what has been, for example, in terms of family income over time, how this has progressed in certain areas of the city where we work, how it compares with other parts of the city or other cities in the same country. So this is what makes us unique, the sense that culture is not a handicap, is not a mortgage, but is rather an asset that has and could be exploited in the benefit of the communities that live around or in those cultural sectors.
So Luis, just building on that idea of culture compounding with other inputs or other areas of development that AKDN is also working on, could you give us a couple of specific examples to illustrate this?
The Award for Architecture organized a seminar in Cairo with a very distinguished specialist on architecture and so on. And His Highness attended the seminar, and he viewed from the top of a very important monument, a Mamluk house, where Hassan Fatih, the famous architect, lives. Visiting Hassan Fatih from the top of his house, he saw this barren land in Cairo, the Darasa Hills, and he asked how much green land there was in Cairo, how many parks, and they say, oh, there are no parks here, there's a derelict zoo. And then he said, I've been so impressed by the city, by the seminar here, that I would like to offer as a gift a park to the city of Cairo. It took a long time to develop that project, to establish the agreements with the Egyptian government, with the governorate of Cairo. And when I arrived here to this job, I found that the project was ready to start in 2002. When we started to build the park, we realized that it was not possible only to build the park. Next to the park, the boundary of the park, are the Ayyubid and Fatimid walls of the city. And in the other side of the walls, intramuros, there was the highest levels of poverty in town. So you cannot simply build a very good park with all the modern facilities and not to address the need of what is happening the other side of the wall. And that's what this combination in the Historic Cities program of urban rehabilitation and green spaces started. Then the impact it has been phenomenal, because as I was said earlier, by the combination of bringing microfinance programs that allow families to develop small businesses, to improve their own living conditions. The provision of medical resources and so on. The whole level of this very poor area rose in the past 15 years, has been one of the areas of Cairo which has experienced the highest level of development. So, and all this is fully documented. This was the prototype that demonstrated that the theory was feasible, and then this has been applied in other places, large areas in Kabul, the area of Nizamuddin Basti in Delhi, etc., etc.
The Aga Khan Trust for Culture is present in Afghanistan and Syria, two war-torn countries. And I'd like to understand a little bit about the challenges of operating in such an environment.
Well, since I arrived to this job, His Highness told me, we work in difficult places. So I knew that from the very beginning. And my first job, I arrived to this job in the 1st of January 2002. On the 5th of January, I was in Kabul. These countries are difficult. But somehow, what we've done in Afghanistan, what we have achieved in Afghanistan has been easier than in other countries, with a much more stable situation, but with a lot more red tape. We have restored about 400 buildings. We've been in many places, and this has been relatively easy in a country which was in a transition, in a country which was in reconstruction. What is happening today in Afghanistan? Well, I must tell you that our projects continue in Afghanistan. The secret of succeeding in all these places is, as opposed to other institutions in the world, is that our teams are formed by people from the country. They are national teams, 100% national teams. In Afghanistan, they are Afghan. In Syria, they are Syrians, etc. In Egypt, they are Egyptians, etc. And that's fundamental because the people understand the idiosyncrasy of the country, and is what allows us to, to navigate in sometimes these difficult waters.
So, Lewis, in 2015, Hazrat Imam said,
cultural heritage projects are not a diversion from development priorities. Culture is, in and of itself, a development resource of immense potential value.
Thinking about post-conflict or reconstruction, how does this inform the work that AKTC does? What are your thoughts on this particular quote?
The reconstruction of cultural assets, like is the case in Syria, our project in the souk in Aleppo, are very important for many reasons. First of all, because in this particular case, help directly to restore the commercial circuits that have been interrupted by the war. They allow people to come back to the place, to reestablish their businesses. And for many of these people, the little shop in the souk is the only source of revenue. But I think the sentence of His Highness says everything. It is not diverting resources from other aspects of development. It means that cultural heritage also has an appeal to donors that will not, in this case, it's not diverting from health or sanitation or education, are funds which are at their origin already directed to culture and cultural heritage. We find this in many European governments that they have this concept. The Norwegians, for example, are very generous also in supporting things that have to do with immaterial culture, in our case with music. It's the principle of subsidiarity. It's not that the various agencies of AKDN are competing for single sources of funding. It's the fact that these agencies in AKDN are so diverse in the fields they operate that they open more possibilities for co-funding from third parties. And I think this is a very intelligent, strategic way that on which His Highness has planned this today, the largest development agency, private development agency that exists in the world.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I understand there's a photo that you've taken in the recently published book, Depth of Field. I wonder if you could just share a bit about that.
I remember very well how this photo was taken, because it was a very special moment. It was in 2007. His Highness had arrived to Agra for the ceremonies of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And it was the day before, I think. He said that he would like to go to see Fatehpur Sikri, the great capital of Fatehpur Sikri. And he wanted to do this as a very private visit. So I was the only person with him. I think there were some security people, he and me. And I always travel with, my real hobby is photography, and I work with all cameras, all Leicas with film, and that time was still fashionable in 2007. All this junk that is around us of digital cameras did not exist. And I accompany him, and I know Fatehpur Sikri very well. So I was trying to drive him to an inner part of the palace. And I found there are some arches in the background. It was very, very low level of light. He was wearing a white Indian suit. And the contrast between the twilight of this misty architecture in the background and his white presence there was so inspiring. I said, Your Highness, do you mind? I know he doesn't like people taking pictures of him, but I realized that he was ready for it. So I said, Your Highness, do you mind? And then I placed him. We were alone, nobody else. There were some pigeons around. And I took this photo with great apprehension, because the light was limited. I had to have a very open diaphragm, which gives a bokeh of the background, which was very interesting, and I was hoping that it will succeed. And the photo, well, I shouldn't say that, but it's okay, and it's been published in this book and in other books before, and it's something I have. It's the only picture I've taken in my life that I frame, and it's this in my office.
Amazing. It sounds beautiful. So we're now approaching, I think it's 65 years. Hazrat Imam will be celebrating 65 years of his imamate this year. And you've talked about this kind of compound, sort of multi-input approach. Can you talk a little bit about his legacy from your perspective? I mean, you've worked with him for what, 20 years or more?
21 years.
Role, 21 years.
21 years.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on his legacy for the
Well,
65?
I think his legacy is fabulous. You can already describe what he has created, and you could deduct what has been built. First of all, he has always, that's what I've learned, one of the many things I've learned from him. He has always think with a sense of long term, not short term. And that's what has made so many things that he has proposed feasible. Many things are not feasible because the people only think in the short term. If we look at our governments in our democratic countries you realize that the planning is always very short because the political terms, the political calendar is very short. His Highness has planned everything to the long term, and also knowing that the imamat is a permanent institution, so that the things will be continued.
And specifically over the last 21 years, what are the learnings, other than the sort of the generational thinking you've mentioned, what are the other learnings that you've taken away from your proximity to Hazrat Imam?
Well, first of all, as I said, strategic vision. The second, a capacity, an endless capacity to work, day and night. And I could explain many anecdotes of traveling with His Highness and hours of intense work, but this was every day of his life. Never give up. It's something I can also think about a number of episodes where he is, when he thinks something has to be achieved, he stays in his point until the end. And then his way of thinking and listening, a way of thinking globally, as I said before, but thinking globally and integrating in that thinking whatever he thinks could be useful of the people that surround him. A capacity to put together in a coherent plan, in a coherent vision, benefiting also and identifying himself things that could enrich his plan. And this is something that explains also, not as an imam, but as a president, as a chairman of a large development agency, why this agency has succeeded in so many aspects. And I said perhaps at the beginning, I work with many other people. I work in American foundations, in European banks, in the international public service, and so on. And I reported to many important people, but I never been so fascinated by the personality of His Highness, and that's why, in a way, I left my previous job without regrets. It was a very interesting job, but I left it without regrets because I wanted to have an opportunity, as I had. That has been a great bonus for me, as I had during these past 21 years, to have the honor to serve His Highness.